All right, everyone. Today is extra special because it's not every day that you're joined by a cousin screenwriter dream team like we are with Kaz and Ryan Firpo. Welcome to Friends from Work. Woo!
Oh wow!
Kyle,
Welcome.
Robbie, it's a pleasure. It's Kaz. It's honestly, we're very excited to talk to you guys and to talk about movies, shows, why we tell stories, all the fun stuff.
I love it. Let's start big picture for a second. First of all, how did you land this project? Let's start there.
I mean, that is like
Yeah.
a multi-year question. We like to say this saying in Hollywood that it is a 10-year overnight success story. That's like
Yeah.
every Hollywood story is like that. Like
Mm.
you have been grinding and telling stories and like making movies in your backyard, and that's how you finally made that first movie and saw your name on that marquee. The short version of the story for your listeners and for ourselves. Ryan and I are cousins. We grew up telling stories together. Literally, there's a photo of him holding me as a newborn baby. Like that's how
Wow.
OG our
Aw.
collaboration actually is. Yeah,
Fantastic.
I'm like still red and quite ugly, but he's like thumbs up. Like it's a great photo. And that's how far it goes back. You know, like we literally
Mm.
were playing around with green screens on his like dad's mini DV camera when we were like little kids.
That's
And we just
incredible.
kind of came at Hollywood from really different ways. I was like a full blown film school brat. I knew I wanted to make movies from like a really young age. I only applied to two film schools. I went to NYU and Tisch and just sort of went through the 4 years in New
Mm.
York, like making movies. And I was actually in undergrad when Chloe was in grad school, the director of the film. So it was
Hmm.
just like tons of
Wow.
overlap. Like her co-producer Nomadland produced my thesis film. It was like a really small little film school club out there. And
Had y'all
so,
met?
and I yeah, sorry, what's that?
Had you and Chloe met whenever you were in
We,
school
we
there?
we hadn't met, but we literally she walked in the room and immediately was just like, "I know all your friends," and that was like the first thing she said to us, and we were like, oh, "Okay," and immediately, it was just a vibe. We just got along really well,
That's
and
awesome.
so kind of from there, we just approached filmmaking from different sides. I was in film school, and Ryan was living in the Bay Area, kind of just working as a skate rat.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wasn't working as a skater. When I was a teenager, I was really into skating, and that's kind of how I got into filmmaking because I just watched skate videos, and that was when like Spike Jones was making a bunch of stuff for Girl and chocolate skateboards. And
Hmm.
so I really got more interested in the filmmaking at some point than the skateboarding. And that kind of got me really interested in making my own films. And that was a time when like DV cameras were just coming out and iMovie and all that stuff. And so I just started making movies with all my friends. And it was a blast. And I went to film school also, but I went only for one semester and kind of realized that it wasn't really for me. And then the next semester, I took $5,000, which is the tuition money, and just made a feature film instead. And that became like my film school.
Oh
Um,
wow.
yeah, and it was just like this DV feature that I just did, like with essentially just all a bunch of favors, like shooting at friends' houses and working with like a really small crew, like 5-person
Mm.
crew basically.
Hmm.
And so after that, I just started working in the Bay Area as mostly as an editor. And but I still knew that I wanted to make films, like real films. But I always thought that I would be like more of an independent filmmaker and didn't even know if I would ever like work in the studio system. And so around that time, I was trying to figure out like who's going to pay for all my movies. And I was playing a lot of poker at that time, and like was really kind of involved in the poker world. And I discovered like online poker, and there was a whole online poker community of all these kids that were like 20 years old and making like $1 million a month playing online poker.
This
And
is
I was
not
kind
where
of
I
like,
thought this story was going. This
yeah,
is
yeah, I
Oh
know.
unbelievable.
yeah.
No,
Loving
we
it
have,
though.
yeah, like you said, two different directions. But then, yeah, and so my first thought was like, oh, this is the greatest untapped resource for independent film financing. So then it became my goal to basically infiltrate this community and befriend them and have them pay for all my movies. And so over the course of like a year, I befriended a lot of like very successful high stakes pros, and we kind of started meeting in person. And that led to them actually financing a feature length documentary about online poker. It was this movie called Bet Race Fold, and it was made entirely with
Hmm.
winnings from these poker pros.
Oh,
And yeah, and they just basically there was no oversight. They just gave me like a bunch of money, and they were just like, yeah, just go make the movie. And so over the course of like 3 years, I produced, directed, and edited this feature documentary, and then we got distribution. You can see it on Amazon even today. And so that was my first experience of just like raising money, making a movie, and then
Hmm.
sending it out into the world and having strangers watch it. And then around that time, and it was a really great experience. But around that same time, Kaz, who had been directing commercials out of New York, uh, for a few years, he approached me and was kind of like, hey, you know, we should make a movie together. And so we had always had this unofficial collaboration, but it became official when he asked me to co-write this script called Ruin with him. And that was our first official collaboration, that ended up being the script that kind of broke us into Hollywood and ultimately got to Nate Moore and landed us the Marvel gig.
I love that coming up at some
Wow.
family reunion, like backyard barbecue. Like, hey, should we go do this together? I love that.
That's
Yeah, for
incredible.
us, it was a crazy journey. You know, I was working in New York as a commercial director, and I ended up in documentary as well. Because I always say this, you know, documentary is an incredible way where I don't know your audience, if it's film students, filmmakers, everyone who loves
Mhm.
Marvel movies, you know, everything in between. But telling stories, you know, telling a documentary story is a really powerful way to tap into like really serious emotions and like really intense stuff. And
Mhm.
you don't need permission to go make a difference. You don't need a huge budget to make a powerful story. And so that's where I kind of came from in this doc world. I was working with UNICEF and traveling, and I
Hmm.
worked in Greece and the Syrian border and in southern Mexico, telling stories about sort of the human stories about migration, about refugee
Hmm.
crises and asylum seekers. And that was truly, you know, during this time period, I'm like, man, no one's going to give us the money to make our own movie, but we have so many stories to tell. And I basically called the best writer I knew, who I happened to be related to, and begged him to like come spend 3 weeks in a cabin in the woods and write a movie, you know, start to finish. And that's really what we did. And we, you know, we didn't have agents, we didn't have managers, we didn't have the uncle in Hollywood that we could call and say like, "Hey, give me that meeting with Jerry Bruckheimer." Like we just didn't have that. It really was this process of like, let's write a script that we could go make for like under $1 million. Like we'll get like a grant, we'll get like the Sundance Award, like we'll go and make this movie and basically become the filmmakers we knew we are, but we haven't gotten that chance yet.
Hmm.
And so Ruin ended up winning the Blacklist in Hollywood, which is this unofficial
Hmm.
list of the
Oh
best
yeah.
scripts that haven't been made yet. And that was really the thing that opened a lot of doors for us and got us in the room with Kevin and Nate over at Marvel. And from then, it was just like it was a no brainer. You know, it was a project with Eternals. It answered so many questions about the stories we were trying to tell. It touched on so much
Right.
stuff that we were so interested in, from ancient history, gods and mythology, you know, big existential questions. It was just something like it was an opportunity for us to play in an enormous sandbox and to really ask some big questions.
Hmm.
Well, and not just big in terms of the kind of cosmic or even like theological side of that, but also big in terms of kind of a global scope. Like you talk about making movies sort of all around the world, and you definitely get a sense that that's something that y'all are passionate about bringing into Eternals.
Hmm.
Mhm.
That's spot on. I mean, my roommate in college introduced me to Bollywood movies, and that
Hmm.
was like, there's not an accident. You know, I've been to India 3 or 4 times for projects and spent a lot of time out there, and it was just such an incredibly vivid place. But it has such a special film industry, and we were like, well, it's such a fun thing to go and see and explore in our own stories, you know, in our own
Hmm.
movies. And so, Eternals was a chance to sort of write this world we always wanted to see and reflect a lot of that stuff. You know, reflect an audience that could see themselves in the story. And really, from the beginning, we had this incredible free hand from Marvel. They really wanted to try something different and to try something new. And so they just were at that place in phase four, you know, in the canon, where I think there was an opportunity to really to swing big.
I love
Right.
that kind of transition be perfect into the next question, because you were talking about how you've always made movies just that you want to make on lower budgets, et cetera. Well, obviously now you walk into the largest budget you can possibly have in making this movie, but also you're trying to tell a story that's unique and standalone, but you are still jumping on a train that's already, you know, 25 stops on, just taking it to the next stop. So I guess what are the challenges that go into, like, how much thought went into how does this fit in the MCU versus like, how do we make this a standalone story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Marvel's genius is their first priority is just to make a good movie, you know, on all their
Hmm.
projects, you know, and then they kind of will maybe reverse engineer it and sometimes to basically make sure that it fits into the larger story. But so with Eternals in particular, it's such like a siloed story. I mean, that's just built into the lore essentially. Like they were deliberately not allowed to interfere in all the kind
Hmm.
of happenings of the MCU. So we always kind of viewed it as this. We weren't essentially like too concerned about fitting it in with the existing storyline because it was just so separate. And
Yeah, it's just that you had this opportunity to take characters that people hadn't seen before, and to play in this enormous world. We often liken the Marvel metaphor to this cup. There's like they have this glass, and they're like, okay, here's the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You can do whatever you want in that cinematic universe as long as you don't affect the sanctity of the ability to drink water out of this cup. You don't disrupt what's there. You can't say like Captain America is actually made out of bees. Like you can't go back and retrofit like what was or what. I know Kyle's into that idea. Captain Bee America. The point is you can't go blow up what's there, but you can add to it, and that's so much fun. That's inherent to the medium of comics themselves. If you guys read comics, you have different authors, different artists playing with the same characters over and over again, and expanding and growing these mythologies, and it's sort of this shared collaborative thing, and that's a big part of how Marvel does it.
Yeah, and just speaking to the scope of it all, Nate had a really good analogy that he said during the process, because we were just sort of like, hey, yeah, we love Chloe, she's amazing. She's also like, she's made obviously really small movies compared to Eternals. And he kind of told us, and this was directed at us too, that, making a movie is kind of like walking a tightrope, and when you're making a smaller movie, perhaps that tightrope is only like 3 feet off the ground. And then when you're making something like Eternals, maybe it's like 300 feet off the ground, but really the process is the same. It's just one step in front of the other, and everything's going to be okay as long as you don't look down. And Marvel is just really, really good at keeping you from looking down and just keeping you focused on the story and making the movie and putting one step in front of the other. So, just the scope and the machine and all that stuff, they really did a great job at kind of insulating us from all those kind of external pressures.
Speaking of comics, I got to, and speaking of scope, I got the chance to kind of dig back into some old Eternals comics that I hadn't read in years ahead of the film, as well as kind of the Gaiman stuff and even the current Gillen stuff, which is fantastic. And I was really curious from y'all's perspective. You get tasked now with writing this movie, or get the opportunity to write this movie, and there is so much out there, and it can be even kind of disjointed at times in terms of how the comic mythology has worked. And it's not like, Civil War, where, okay, well, we're going to start with the Civil War comic, or even like an Iron Man 1, where you're going to start with sort of this rough idea of an origin that everyone's sort of familiar with. Like y'all, in some sense, had a ton of material to work with, but I would think also a lot of different options for how to adapt it.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's no question. For us, the number one, like, penultimate mission with this film and with the story was to do justice to Jack Kirby's incredible Gonzo universe. Like Jack Kirby is the author. I would say he's really the father. Almost everything that audiences love about the MCU, these characters, how they look, their powers. And he's so responsible for that. And his, I don't want to say his baby, but his sort of love child in the MCU were the Eternals, something that he created, something that he wrote, these characters that were all his, that were really riffing on new stories of the old gods, something that he'd clearly always been fascinated with. And for me personally, as someone who studied classics and archaeology in school and really had a lot of love for the ancient world, these superhero stories we're telling are just continuations of the same 2,000-year-old traditions about gods and heroes that are stronger and more powerful than humans, because I think it makes it easier to be human when you realize that even the gods have problems. Yeah. And so for us with Eternals, you're taking this massive thing, this massive universe, and you're looking at all this material and you're saying, what's going to fit into here? But most importantly, are we going to do justice to Jack Kirby?
Yeah, and also I'd say that just even in the room when Nate first told us about Eternals, and we hadn't heard of the property at that point, and just right away we just realized that this was a chance to do a story about ancient superheroes who have watched humanity grow up all throughout time, and now they have to wrestle with the question: is humanity worth saving? And so we always knew that was kind of like the seed of the idea. And then it just became looking at the canon and looking at the runs and taking the elements from each one that could help amplify that story.
Watching each character struggle with the gray area of what you're just talking about, of like, how do we handle now that we found out what our purpose was, is probably our favorite part about the movie. And one subtle plot point that's actually led to a ton of discussion amongst our listeners was the plot point of having Kingo walk away at the end and not be a part of the final battle. And Robbie and I both kind of love that, because I think, I mean, we have our own take on it and how it shows that everyone's going to react to this in a different way. And he decides to basically peacefully protest. Like, he doesn't have the answer. He doesn't know, but I'm not going to fight you to the death on it. How early in the process was that a decision that was made that, hey, not every Eternal is going to be here at the end, like so clear cut on one side or the other?
Yeah.
This is what we like to say, is that the whole movie predicates on this kind of core thematic conflict, which is really about soldiers who are loyal to their mission, loyal to the duty to, they're responsible, for this mission that they have, versus the love that you have in your life for the people, the family, and the people you're here to protect, the humans you're here to protect. And every Eternal falls somewhere on that continuum. Some of them, they believe completely in this mission, like Icarus, for an example. Like, he puts his duty, this as a soldier, above his love for everyone in his life. And it kills him, and it's torture, but that's his belief system. He believes that this is right and just. And Cersei's on the other end of the spectrum, somebody who really loves the people and is willing to question her gods and her faith, to have that serious conflict, that battle, and put everything else, to go to war about it. And then, like you said, something that we felt was really strong, that represents that this is a continuum. That I don't believe that Icarus is inherently a bad person, or that Cersei is inherently a good person. They're acting according to their belief systems. And Kingo falls squarely in that, on that continuum, on that spectrum, where he believes, look, I think that what we're doing is right and just, but I won't kill my brothers and sisters to do it, to follow through with it. And that's only a crazy gonzo movie like Eternals can really dive into that type of stuff, because it's really, it's existential. And I think that's one of the things we set out to do with this film.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question about when did that come about, it really was like in early drafts. Like, I think in every draft he always walked away.
Can confirm, Kingo never fought in the end battle. It was always about, his belief system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I think it just speaks to like the complexity of the moral dilemma that they're faced with. That it's not just so simple of like, let's fight, and it also just speaks to kind of the broader perspective that they have that goes beyond a human perspective. Like, obviously as an Earthling, anything that threatens the Earth, you're just like, well, we have to stop that. But they don't operate on that level. They're thinking about the cosmos as a whole, which makes makes it such a much more complicated issue for them. And Kingo's decision really highlights that.
One last thing that Ryan often says that I really like, that I want to make sure we say, is that Kingo is also in many ways one of the most human Eternals, because he really is living as a human. He's one of the few that's like sort of publicly living as a human. And I think in some ways there's a bit of fear, that he knows that if he fights with Icarus, like, he'll die forever. Whereas he believes, like, look, at the worst case, even though I love hanging out here, I'm having a great time, I'd rather stay true to my beliefs, wake up on another planet and do all this over again than die for good. And that's the type of thing. Every character has, I think, that level of complexity in the choices that they make. We like to think, anyway.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's almost as though, as the event of the movie, or the events of the movie, were sort of crystallizing, it almost became a matter of how would each of these characters, based on who we know them to be, respond to this inciting event. And it feels like that came out really, really naturally. And you wound up with, like you said, this whole spectrum of reactions that also is sort of informing, in terms of, hopefully folks see themselves in those different characters, even though, again, we are talking about kind of gods and heroes.
Well, and on that spectrum, we actually got a chance to talk to Leah McHugh last week about Sprite. And that was another one of our favorite things, was we told her that was her decision there, and how that, plays a role for her with wanting to be human, even though she knows she's going to die. Those were two of our favorite plot points.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah. And that was a decision that was like that from the pitch stage. That was made from the pitch stage. So we really appreciate it that you, all these years later, can appreciate it on the same level. I think that it also just all goes back to that core question of, is humanity worth saving? And there is something almost kind of like magical about this Earth 616, that Ajax picks up on, that she's first the one to plant those seeds of doubt. And I think that there's something very attractive about being mortal, because when you're immortal, when you live forever, every moments are not precious the same way that they are when you're mortal. You know, if you're a human and you only have like
Right.
80 years, then, you know, and so
Gotta
I think that
get
I
busy
think there's a
living,
kind of like
you know?
fascination. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
So
there's
there's a fascination that the Eternals would have with that.
the juxtaposition
Sorry.
of humans that do die, but they're looking for eternal life, and then the
Yeah.
Eternals who have life, but do you really live if there's no ending, kind of thing. I love that
Right.
whole concept in the movie. When you found out that this cast, I don't know how this works as far as when the casting comes up versus screenwriting, but like obviously you're working with a massive cast of A-list actors. In that process, does that influence your writing at all? When you like, are you picturing someone particular when you're writing it?
Like 1000%. You know, that's
Yeah.
the joy of writing any movie, is that you can really, you're writing the blueprint for what something could be. So like in
Yeah.
this particular case, I mean, we're literally sitting in this windowless writer's room called Black Widow. You know, you have a key card to swipe into it. It's all top secret. And we're sitting in there and we're like, you know, this has got to be Kumail. Like, there's nobody else. Like, that role, all we're doing is, you know, we're giving them life, and then the actors give them a soul. You know, and that's what we're trying to do. Is we're sitting around and you know, Athena, we got a call. Nate walked in, our producer, he walked into the room, and he's just like, "Is there a role for Angie?" And we're like, "Who's Angie?" And he's like, "Oh, Angelina wants to be in the movie." And we were like, yes, we have a great role for her, and it's going to be an amazing arc. She should totally do it. And he's like, great. And then he comes back the next day. She's like, okay, so she's Thena. And it was like that a lot of the way. It was really a really wonderful process. I mean, we wrote that role for Salma from the beginning. There's just no one who has that like matriarchal power. And so the whole process was a lot of discovery like that.
Wow.
Yeah, and for me, like I worked many years as an editor, and when you're an editor, you often get into these spots where you're kind of like looking at the pieces that you have, and you're just like, oh, I wish I had this other piece of movie, or I wish the character said this instead. But you can't really do anything when you're an editor because you just work with what you got. But when you're a writer, you can, you know. And so, like for me, what I'm really doing is I'm just picturing the movie in my head and editing it a bunch of different ways, and then just simply transcribing what I see inside my head. And so it really helps me to see the actors like as if I was walking in and seeing an actual movie. So I've always pictured actors for every movie beyond this. But the really great thing about Marvel is that all the other stuff that I wrote, you know, you might have somebody in mind, but you're just like, how am I ever going to get to them? With Marvel, it's just like they just pick up the phone, and then 3 days later, they're like, yeah, they're in the movie. So it's really exciting to watch that unfold.
Wow. I have one question on the actors front, because that's such a fascinating answer. I think the Marvel side of things, like what Kyle talked about at the very start here, you know, and adding the extended universe that you're sort of making a movie that's a part of, even though Eternals is largely within its own realm, you do still have connecting tissue. And I was curious, like from y'all's standpoint, how early on did y'all know that you were going to have Dane Whitman appear in the movie and have Eros appear in the movie? Or I say, how early did y'all know? Were those ideas that y'all yourselves brought to the table? Kind of what does that process look like?
Yeah, early on, Eros was just candidly, I don't think this is a spoiler, he was just in every draft. You know, he's such a great character. His literal powers to make people fall in love with him. No one could do that but Harry Styles. And he's really, and Kyle. He's one of those galactic Eternals. You know, that was one of those things. I mean, there's literally hundreds of Eternals. And we chose these sort of 10 out of this incredible list. And Eros is someone we always liked, but he's sort of infamously godlike. He's a cosmic eternal. He always, because they set out in space, you know, and he's Thanos' brother. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that's going on there. So yeah, a lot of these characters were in from the jump, and you know, so much of it is always about making these decisions about, you know, leaving doors open. And I think Eros is just one of those characters that just leaves an incredible door open for like where we can go in you know, number 2, number 3, number 7 if we're lucky.
Yeah, and with Dane, you know, when we first kind of started putting the pitch together, we had all these cards of just like 50 plus Eternals, and we just started kind of like singling it and narrowing it down one by one until we had it down to 10 or 12 at the time. And so that's, and I hadn't heard of Dane Whitman up to that point, and I was just really fascinated with him as a character, because there's actually a run that in the comics where he basically is his heart broken. He has his heart broken by Cersei, and he's actually he's a physicist, so he figures out how to travel into the multiverse, and he basically goes through into every multiverse, into every dimension, and kills all the Cerseis that he finds there. And so I was like, they'll never do that, you know, or maybe, who knows, never, but they'll never do that. But I was like, that's a really fascinating character. So he kind of just basically like got put into sort of like the reserve pile, and then as we tried out different things in the draft, he eventually got pulled into the story.
Yeah.
Well, one, we are big fans of the movie. Two, we're big fans of you guys. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an honor for us. Seriously. Love this kind of stuff.
Likewise, it's a joy to be able to talk about the process, and thank you guys for being big fans and asking weird and good questions, because that's what we're always trying to do. We're trying to unpack, you know, what did this happen? Why does these movies are, you know, 10,000 people making millions of choices, and so it's a miracle when anyone gets made, but more importantly, it's such a miracle when movies come out and they find their audience, and people can find and discover new things and keep talking about it. So yeah, for us, we always wanted to tell sort of an epic love story. And at the end of the day, you know, this was something, Marvel taking a big chance on something different, and just watching the way that the world has reacted. It's been a great pleasure. So we're really glad you guys enjoyed it.
Well, you asked us earlier sort of what our listeners were like. And for the most part, they're just film lovers. Obviously Marvel film lovers, especially, but our listeners have absolutely loved Eternals. Like as soon as they saw it, you know, Kyle and I got to see it early, and we were so curious to see, because it's so different in so many ways. We like couldn't wait to hear from folks. And like immediately people were like, oh my gosh, top 3 Marvel movie, top 2 Marvel movie. And it's been so fun to see how much people have latched on to such a complex story that y'all told, whenever often the narrative is, oh, superhero movies can't do this. To see it be done, and to be done in a way that resonates so much with fans has been great. So thank you all.
That's why we tell stories, Robbie. You got it right there. So
you guys have an open invitation to join us whenever you want. So if you ever need,
we got a lot of projects coming up, a lot of movies coming up. So hopefully we'll be on this podcast. I want to be on 3 times a year. All right?
Okay.
That's my plan.
Love it.
That's our goal. Count it. All right. Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it.
All right. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Look forward to it.